This weekend's International Conference on Drug Policy Reform. The 5th annual meeting took place in Washington, D.C., sponsored by the Drug Policy Foundation. The foundation is an independent organization committed to new ways of thinking about drugs and the war on them. We're about to present the keynote address for the meeting delivered by Milton Friedman. Mr. Friedman is a Nobel laureate and a senior research fellow at the Hoover Institution. He is the 1991 recipient of the Richard J. Dennis Drug Peace Award for outstanding achievement in the field of drug policy reform. That award is presented by the Drug Policy Foundation. Now, Milton Friedman's comments.
Good morning to you all. I'm Arnold Trebek, a professor at American University and the president of the Drug Policy Foundation. This is the 5th International Conference on Drug Policy Reform here in Washington. We are now preparing for our keynote speech. Before I introduce our honored speaker, let me explain to those of you who don't know that the foundation is an independent group in Washington which helps to promote the idea that opposition to the drug war is decent, respectable, and more in line with basic American values than those who advocate a war on drugs. Our speaker this morning is Milton Friedman. He will get a very short introduction because most of you know him, much of the world knows him. In a way, he's like a force of nature. He makes people think, even those who may disagree with some of his philosophy. He writes simple English sentences about very complicated material. He can even make someone like me, who's fearful of economics, understand a concept now and then. Recently, within the last 20 years, he has taken positions advocating the legalization of drugs in line with free market principles. Many people have done so, but the manner in which Professor Friedman did so reached the hearts and minds of many people, millions of people, it can be said. Milton Friedman is the 1976 Nobel Prize winner for excellence in economics. He has been a senior research fellow at the Hoover Institution in California since 1977. He is also Paul Snowden Russell Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Chicago, where he taught from 1946 to 1976. He is widely regarded as the leader of the Chicago School of Monetary Economics. He has published many books, including Capitalism and Freedom with Rose D. Friedman, Bright Promises, Dismal Performance, Free to Choose, and he has been a presenter of distinguished television series over PBS. We know him as a man who commands immense respect and immense attention. Why don't we listen to him? Professor Friedman.
Thank you very much, Dr. Trebek, for that fine introduction. I like brief introductions. Leaves me more time to speak. In 1972, almost 20 years ago, President Nixon introduced the first intensified war on drugs since the original Harrison or Sullivan Act. Harrison Act. I always get Harrison and Sullivan Acts mixed. And in response to his introduction of the war on drugs, I wrote a column at the time I was writing a column in Newsweek on a regular basis, and I wrote a Newsweek column on prohibition and drugs. In preparation for this talk today, I reread that column. Hardly a word in it would have to be changed to be publishable today and to be strictly contemporary. The only changes are really in inessential elements. In 1972, the problem for the United States was primarily heroin, and the chief source of the heroin was Marseille. Today, you would talk about cocaine and Latin America. But aside from that, nothing would have to be changed. Here it is, almost 20 years later, and the only changes is that what at that time were predictions are now observable results. I predicted in that column, on the basis primarily of the experience with prohibition, that drug prohibition would be ineffective in cutting down the number of addicts, and that it would promote a crime and corruption. How is it that the only effect on policy of the conversion of predictions into results has been to have the government dig itself deeper and deeper into a bigger and bigger hole and spend more and more of your and my money on doing harm? How is it? That's both the most discouraging aspect of this whole problem and also the most intriguing intellectual puzzle. In our private lives, if we try something and it goes screwy, we don't just continue and do it bigger and bigger. Maybe we will for a little while, but sooner or later we can't. Why is it that that isn't the case when we come to a matter like drugs and governmental policy? There's little point. I want to talk about that puzzle. There's little point in this group to my discussing in detail the case for the legalization of drugs. Everyone in this room knows it. You have had numerous workshops in which people who are more immediately familiar with the details than I have discussed the issues, and I'm not going to try to do that. I want to rather examine the puzzle that I listed. And in doing so, I'm going to rely on an adage that my Bartlett traces back to 325 BC. Cobbler, stick to your last. My last is economics, the study of how society organizes its limited resources to meet the many and varied wants of its citizens, of its members. Fundamentally, there are only two methods by which society's resources can be organized. Only two, all mixtures of them, but only two. One is by market mechanisms. That's from the bottom up. The other is by command. That's from the top down. The market is one mechanism. Authoritarian organization, the military is a clear example, is the other. The general gives the order, the colonel passes it on to the lieutenant, captain, and so on down the line. In the market, the orders come the other way. The consumer walks into a store and gives the order, and the orders go up. They have very different characteristics and are suited to handle very different problems. I believe that some element of both is needed in any society, and whether I believe that or not, every society has some mixture of those elements. We know the extreme cases, and we know what happened in those extreme cases, particularly since the fall of the Berlin Wall. But what we have in our own society is also a very, very large mixture of those two methods. During the many years that I've been sort of peripherally engaged in discussing the issue of drugs, I should emphasize that's not a vocation of mine, it's an avocation, I've been very much impressed by two things. First, most of the literature I read on drugs takes it for granted that the drug problem is a special case to be discussed in terms of the particular issues associated with drugs, the substances involved and so on, rather than a particular manifestation of a more general phenomenon. And they take it for granted that it has to be discussed in terms of its own merits, involving an extensive knowledge of the details. It's as if, from my view, one were to discuss the desirability of theft in terms of what object was stolen. So theft of automobiles is one problem, theft of handbags is another problem. In the same way, people treat the prohibition of drugs as if it were a problem to itself. Second, one consequence of that view is that many of the people who propose doing something about the war on drugs propose alternatives which would be just as bad. They think that the problem is not that the government is involved in this doesn't have anything to do with that. Not that you're using the wrong mechanism, but simply they haven't done it right. That must, in my view, most of these would involve simply going from the frying pan to the fire. They not only think that the problem is that we aren't doing right, they have the illusion that if they could write the law would be enforced the way they wrote it. But that is an illusion. What happens to a law has very little relation, in general, to the intentions of the people who wrote it. The people who wrote the law on drugs did not intend to kill hundreds of thousands of people in the process. They did not intend to have a system under which you would have a multiplication of prisons and prisoners. In general, the intentions of the people who write a law end up being the opposite of what the law actually achieves. A phenomenon that one of the congressmen here in an earlier guise, when he was a simple professor, termed the invisible foot of government. Let me illustrate with a few quotations from letters that I have received. One, quote, "Instead of merely decriminalizing drugs, let's have the government make available drugs free to every user." That would obviously take the profit out of the business. The idea that somehow or other we ought to treat drugs as a free good. There are no free goods. There's no free lunch. It's not free. Somebody would have to pay for it. So we ought to tax the taxpayer to subsidize people who do drugs. But more important, the failure of anybody who says it like that not immediately to see that what would happen to those free drugs is that they would be distributed in Europe and elsewhere where there's a paying market. How do you restrict the quantity demanded of free drugs? Obviously, the only way you restrict them is by having strict rules for distributing it. So you get into a situation where you would have an authoritarian system to distribute those drugs to make sure it wasn't abused. Number two, I promise you, these are honest-to-God quotes from letters I've read. I haven't made them up. Legalize all drugs now illegal to be available only in state stores. Now we've got a lot of experience with state stores in the alcohol area, in the liquor area. In the repeal of the Prohibition Amendment, what was repealed was federal prohibition. States were left free to engage in any measures they wanted to control alcohol. And indeed, the 23rd Amendment, the amendment that repealed the 18th, specifies that carrying alcohol or liquor from a dry state to a wet state shall be regarded as a federal offense and shall be prevented by the federal government. I've forgotten the exact wording. And one of the ways in which states differed was that many states proceeded to set up state liquor stores. Now, the people who say it should be distributed only in state stores argue, well, that would be a way in which you could control the distribution to minors, make sure it wasn't abused, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at the behavior of liquor stores, I know about the state of New Hampshire best because we used to have a second home there. That's located right on the border of Massachusetts in order to attract as many customers over from Massachusetts as possible. And many states have now discovered that they're not really doing very well with the state stores, and there's a movement on to sell them off and privatize them. Again, it's a silly idea. C, abolish the criminality of the use of drugs. Establish a federal monopoly to sell the drugs. That is, you're going to have the post office handle the distribution of drugs. Now, what do these solutions have in common? They're going to cure a problem caused by socialism by some more socialism. It's the standard recourse of the alcoholic, more of the hair of the dog that bit you to get over the hangover, the inevitable hangover. The fundamental problem we face is not the war on drugs. Some of us are most interested in that aspect. But it's only part of a much broader war. The war on drugs and the harm which it does is simply a manifestation of a much broader problem. The substitution of political mechanisms for market mechanisms in a wide variety of areas. To illustrate, I want to go beyond the war on drugs. We all recognize that the war on drugs is destroying our inner cities. But if I were to ask any one of you, what is the next most important element in destroying the inner cities? I suspect a great many of you would agree with me that the next most important element is what is happening to our educational system. The terrible schools in our inner cities. Schools which do not teach, but which are essentially places to keep kids off the streets for a certain number of hours a day. Both failures have exactly the same sources. The war on drugs is a failure because it's a socialist enterprise. Our schooling is deteriorating because it's a socialist enterprise. Except possibly for the military, education is the largest socialist enterprise in the United States. There are a few loopholes. Private schools to which parents can send their children if they can afford to pay for it, or, in the case of parochial schools, if they have certain religious views. But in the main, 90% of all kids are in government schools. And that socialist institution is exactly the same as most other socialist institutions. There's a general characteristic of socialist institutions, whether it's a post office or schools or the war on drugs. It's inefficient, it's expensive, it's very, very profitable and good to a small group of people, and does an enormous amount of harm to a lot of people. That was true of socialism in Russia, it was true of socialism in Poland, it was true of socialism, and it's true of socialism in the United States. Governmental programs, you all know Adam Smith's famous invisible hand, in which people who intend to promote their own interest are led by an invisible hand to promote a public interest which was no part of their intention to promote. And I have for many years argued that there's an inversion of that which is true. People who intend only to pursue the public interest are led by an invisible hand to promote private interests, which was no part of their intention to pursue. That's the case in the drug case. Whose interests are served by the drugs? the U.S. government enforces a drug cartel. The major beneficiaries from the drug prohibition are the drug lords, who can maintain a cartel which they would be unable to maintain. In the education area, the major beneficiaries from the socialized educational program are high-income people living in affluent suburbs who are able to have good public schools, and those public schools serve as a tax shelter for them. If they sent their children to private schools, the tuition they pay is not deductible on their taxes, but if they pay local taxes, that is deductible. And the great mass of people are harmed by the very low quality and declining quality of our schooling system. And the people who are harmed worst of all are the people who live in the inner cities. And these are by no means the only examples. Examine our major national concerns, of which the crime and lawlessness that drug prohibition has spawned is certainly one, and the poor educational performance another. And go on down the list. We have major problems in medical care, with total costs for medical care rising from 4% of the national income to 13% in 40 years. Why? Again, because the government has increasingly socialized medical care, and there is a very strong movement to move all the way to a complete socialization of medical care. In the course of that, the cost of a day spent in a hospital, cost per patient day, in 1989 was 26 times as high after adjustment for inflation as it was in 1946. And the major, in my opinion, the major reason was the growth of socialism in medical care. Look at housing. Why does the Bronx in New York look like a war zone that's just been bombed? Primarily because of rent control. Again, an attempt by the government to socialize the housing industry. We have had extensive and expensive public housing programs. In the course of those public housing programs, more dwelling units have been destroyed than have been built. I challenge you to find any major problem in the United States, any major problem, which you cannot trace back to the misuse of political mechanisms as opposed to market mechanisms. Why is it? The fascinating thing is, to give you a rough estimate, I estimate that by any reasonable measure, the United States today is a little over 50% socialist. That is to say, something over 50% of the total resources in the country, of the total input, is directly or indirectly controlled by governmental institutions at all levels, federal, state, and local. Yet we in the United States have the highest standard of living of any country in the world. We're a very rich and prosperous country. It's an extraordinary tribute to the productivity of the market system that with less than 50% of the resources, it can produce the kind of standard of living and the kind of society we have. If I asked anybody in this room, if I said to you people, you know, you're working from January to close to June 30th, or maybe somewhere over June 30th, to pay for the expenses of government. What fraction of your well-being comes from those governmental programs? Is it anything like 50%? I doubt very much that I would find many who said that's true. So the question that my puzzle raises is, why is it that private enterprises should be successful and government enterprises are not? One common answer is that the difference is in the incentive that somehow the incentive of profit is stronger than the incentive of public service. In one sense, that's right, but in another, it's wrong. The people who run our private enterprises and the people who run our governmental enterprises have exactly the same incentive. In both cases, they want to promote their private interest. Any notion that our public, we call them civil servants. When you sit opposite an IRS person, do you think he's a servant and you're the master? The idea, the people who go into our government, who operate our government, are just as the same kind of people as are in the private sector. They're just as smart in general. They're have just as much integrity. They have just as many altruistic and selfish interests. There's no difference in that way, but the one thing all of them are going to do is to put their private interest first. As Armin Alchian, an economist at UCLA, once put it, the one thing you can depend on everybody else to do is to put his interest above yours. That's a very, very insightful comment. The Chinese who are on the mainland are not different than people from the Chinese who are in Hong Kong. Yet the mainland has been a morass of poverty, and Hong Kong has been an oasis of relative well-being. The people who occupied West Germany and East Germany before they were divided had the same background, the same culture. They were the same people, but the results were drastically different. So the problem is not in the kind of people who run our governmental institutions versus those who run our private institutions. The trouble, as a Marxist used to say, is in the system. And the system is what's at fault. The difference is that the private interest of people in the private sphere is served in a different way. They do different things to serve their private interest. The private interest of people in the governmental sphere is served in a different way. You can illustrate that very simply by considering the bottom line they both face. Here's an idea of a project. It might be suggested to begin with by somebody in the private sphere or by somebody in the government sphere. It might be just as good in one as the other, just as promising. But, all good ideas are conjectures, they're experiments. Most are going to fail. What happens? A private group gets together and starts an enterprise. Suppose it does badly. It starts to lose money. The only way you can keep it going is by digging into your own pocket. You have to bear the costs. That enterprise will not last long. People will shut it down. They'll go on to something else. Now consider a government enterprise. A government enterprise is started, and it doesn't work very well. What happens? They could shut it down, but they have a very different alternative. With the best of intentions, they can believe that the only reason it hasn't done well is because it isn't big enough. And they can finance an extension not out of their own pockets. Indeed, on the contrary, financing an extension will enable them to keep lucrative jobs. But they can finance their extension out of the pockets of the taxpayers if only they can persuade the taxpayer, the legislators and the people who control the purse that their project is a good one. And they are able to do it. Because in turn, the people who vote on it aren't voting their own money. They're spending somebody else's money. And nobody spends somebody else's money as carefully as he spends his own. So the end result is that when a private enterprise fails, it's closed down. When a government enterprise fails, it's expanded. Isn't that exactly what's been happening in the area of drugs? Isn't that what's been happening in the area of schooling? I mentioned we are all aware of the deterioration in schooling. But are you aware that we are now spending per pupil, on the average, 3 times as much as we were 30 years ago, after adjustment for inflation? There's a general rule in government and bureaucratic enterprises: the more you put in, the less you get out. As these socialized enterprises have broadened their reach, it has become more and more difficult for the public to control them. That's a fundamental problem we face in this drug area. How do we get the vested interests of the government to change their policy? It's not an easy job, as we have all discovered. They have a great deal more resources than we have. They are in a position to make it seem not respectable, not reasonable, that after all, these people who want to urge the legalization of the war on drugs are simply ignorant or naive or don't understand what's going on. But as the government has spread into wider and wider areas, it's become more and more difficult to control it, to change it, to get bad programs cut down. In all cases, a major source of getting bad programs out of the way is private competition. The post office used to be just as inefficient in delivering parcels as it is in delivering first-class mail. But because the postal statutes only covered the monopoly on first-class mail, UPS was able to take away their business. Private enterprise destroyed it. Because Federal Express came in. We have case after case, and of course fax developed and so on. So we have case after case where private competition has undermined government monopolies. That's exactly what goes on in the area went on in the area of prohibition in the 20s, and what goes on in the area of drugs now. But unfortunately, the private competition which occurs here is not quite as harmless as UPS or the Federal Express. And that's not an effective solution in this area. In this area, we do have to get the law changed. But my main point is, can be expressed in 2 main points, and that's where I want to close and open it up to questions from you. First, do not fool yourself into thinking that solutions which involve the use of the political mechanism in a different way will in fact work. They will not escape the defects common to the use of the political mechanism wherever it is used. Again, let me emphasize, I am a limited government libertarian, not an anarchist libertarian, though I have a great deal of sympathy for the anarchist libertarian, including the fact that my son is one. But, and you know, I have no prejudice against them. Some of my best friends are. But the role that I would assign to the government, where I think we need to have a government, is not in these areas of using resources for these purposes. It's in the area of law and of defending the country, providing law and order, and helping us determine the rules under which we operate, adjudicating disputes, a very limited range. And as we all recognize, one of the major harms which is being done by the broader extension of governmental activity is that it prevents government from doing those things which I believe only it can do effectively. When people talk about the innocent victims of the war on drugs, they very often forget the people who suffer robberies, theft, murder, not because they get caught in crossfires, not because they're in drug wars, not because of addicts who are trying to support their habit, but simply because all of the police and the enforcement offices are being used to try to control drugs, and there aren't enough people, there aren't enough resources left to maintain, to prevent theft and burglary and the rest in the rest of the community. The second lesson I think we should learn, and probably the more important lesson, is that we are likely to make more progress on the war against the war on drugs if we recognize its link to this broader problem of cutting down the scope and power of the government and restoring power to the people. If we treat it all by itself as an isolated instance, maybe there'll be success, as there ultimately was in the case of Prohibition in the 1920s. But I think our chances of success are greater if we recognize that it's part of a much broader problem. That the same reasons for eliminating the war on drugs are reasons for eliminating the socialization of medicine, the socialization of schools, and so on down the list. Thank you.